Upon the commencement of this meeting, this committee meeting, we have appointed Dr. Tamara Chambers to the Audiology Practice Committee. Welcome.
All right. Good afternoon. So we'll go ahead and call to order this Audiology Practice Committee meeting. It's going to be under AU3 on your binder. First, I need to, do an additional roll call for our committee members. So I am Amy White. So Karen Chang. Here. Dr. Charles Sanders.
Here.
And Dr. Tamara Chambers.
Here.
Excellent. All right, so moving on with our meeting, it looks like we have some discussion, maybe that Ms. Lorenzo is going to bring up. Is that? Yep. Okay, go for it. Say it again. Oh, I'm sorry. Is there any public comment? Is there any public comment to take at this time? No. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White. Maria Lorenzo, Legislation Regulations Budget Analyst. On November 30th, 2023, the Audiology Practice Committee directed board staff to amend drafted proposed regulatory language that will begin to clarify the scope of practice and supervision for audiology aids, as well as implement the statutory changes for audiology aids. The following changes were made to the regulations. A definition to industrial aid was added to define it as a technician certified by the Council of Accreditation in Occupational Hearing Conservation. Requirements for multiple supervisions. Each supervisor must register their aid if the aid has multiple supervisors, and an exemption for industrial audiology aids from registration with the board. Also included changes made were maximum number of audiology support personnel defined as to include support personnel include audiology aids, hearing aid dispensers trainees, and hearing aid dispenser temporary licensees with a definition to full-time equivalent. Changes were made to supervision requirements to require supervisors to manage all patient care, require supervisor to have practice experience prior to supervision, to notify their aides of any disciplinary action against their license, complete continuing education in supervision, review laws and regulations with their aides, and provide their aides with a plan to handle emergency. We also remove industrial aid from supervision requirements and specify tasks that can be performed under indirect supervision, as well as removing industrial aid from the training requirements. Issues to consider is that the proposed definition of an industrial aid may be too broad and may have unintended consequences of permitting audiology aids from not registering with the board or not having adequate supervision when they're not performing services that are not for the purpose of a hearing conservation program. Therefore, it may be prudent to specify supervision requirements for audiologists who provide services for hearing conservation programs on an as-needed basis, and who may use an audiology aid to assist them in providing such services. Business and Profession Code 2530.2M states that the board may, by regulation, exempt certain functions performed by non-industrial audiology aid from supervision, provided their employer has established a set of procedures or protocols that an aid shall follow in performing these functions. According to the Department of Industrial Relations, an audiology aid may qualify as a technician for a hearing conservation program if they satisfactorily demonstrate competence in administering audiometric examinations, obtaining valid audiograms, and properly using and maintaining and checking collaboration and proper functioning of audiometers being used. They may also be permitted to compare each annual audiogram with a baseline audiogram to determine if the audiogram is valid and if the standard threshold shift as defined by DIR in Title 8, California Codes of Regulations, Section 509, which we have as Attachment B. Further, according to Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the professional in charge of the program, which is a licensed or certified audiologist, otolaryngologist, or other physician, does not have to be present when qualified technician conducts audiometric tests. However, the professional's responsibility includes overseeing the program and the work of the technicians, reviewing problem audiograms, and determining whether referral is necessary. And we have a booklet as Attachment C for for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So we have for discussion just more, just to see where the committee would like us to maybe discuss more about industrial audiology aid and what the board needs to do to make sure there's adequate supervision for aides.
Okay, thank you. I think for some background for our new board members to discuss is, so the state, this board has put in different requirements for having audiology aids, what an audiology aid is, what they can or can't do, how they have to be supervised. And then there was this little clause floating in there about industrial aids, and industrial aids are the ones that usually go out in some type of like a van, or they exist in like large factory type places, and they are meeting the OSHA requirements for doing the hearing test, and then making sure that people have proper hearing protection on. So for those aids, it requires a special certification called KAOC. And so for the KAOC certification, that requires a multi-day class. They have to perform practical exam and written exams to be certified. They have to keep up the education, so they have to keep up that certification every couple of years. They have to do a refresher class, they have to renew, they have to test again. So it's very, the KAOC certification process is very well defined, and it's completely separate than the average audiology aid that we're usually talking about in the context of our board meetings. So I think the question was raised about, are we, all these changes that we're making, what are we doing with the industrial audiology aid? Are we treating that separately or not? And I can kick off the discussion with, as I was reading through all the documents that were provided, the handbooks. I think last time we talked as a committee, I was under the impression that the Department of Industrial Relations manages the industrial aids, that there's some sort of process in place because it requires KAOC, because it's kind of in their wheelhouse. We thought it was more their jam, more their responsibility, not so much us. But in looking at what was provided, it doesn't really look like there's a registration process or any sort of control or management of the industrial aids on the Department of Industrial Relations side for the state. I was looking around on their website trying to find registration. I wasn't successful in that. I don't know. I suppose you weren't either.
I know if they're certified by KAOC, they have a providers list, and I think you could do that search, I think by state or by name or number, but right. I'm not familiar with the DRIRs, how they manage that program.
Right, yeah, so KAOC, has the list of certified teachers, the people that can provide the training to become certified, to take the classes. And I'm very familiar with that process as we use that at the VA. But beyond that, it doesn't appear as though the Department of Industrial Relations is, I don't know, managing.
Doesn't seem like they have a licensing and registration program that we're aware of, so that's where it might be a valid question here.
Right, so now to discuss, I think it's kind of taken a step back from where we were talking about this before, because I think last time we were talking about it, I was under the impression they were being registered and followed by this other department, and it doesn't look like that's the case. In which case, we may have to kind of walk back our feeling about, hey, let's just exempt them from all parts of our process and not worry about it. I don't know if that's still reasonable. What do you think?
Yeah, so can anyone identify themselves as an industrial aide? Just because the position that they work under says they are?
That's my understanding.
There's no regulatory body that looks into it to see if they actually pass the KAC training, if they actually use it?
Not
They
that we're
don't
aware
advertise.
of, is the problem.
So then my question is, why are we doing anything about it?
Well, for audiologists, if they are part of the hearing conservation program, they might have an aide that's going to help them with that program. So that's who we're specifically looking at. We're not looking at physicians and who they use, but specifically like audiologists who have employees under them.
Yeah. And how frequent is it, that an audiologist is the one supervising that program and not an otolaryngologist or another physician? I think was kind of where we started this discussion. Like, are we really talking about managing something that does it really exist or does it not really exist? But I know certainly we have a lot of audiologists that work for us at the VA that have done these programs and run these programs, but it's mostly related to Department of Defense. So, on the outside and private sector, I'm not sure. But I think we can't just assume that there aren't audiologists that are supervising these programs in the state of California. So then I think we have lots of questions then, right? That we now have to kind of go back to the drawing board. And in terms of, we can read here and see that they cannot really have to be supervised like our other audiology aides, because that's part of the expectation of the occupational monitoring program, that they be able to be independent to do that. So there has to be some carve out in terms of we can't necessarily hold them to the same.
That would be the interesting part. So if you're going to register them, but they have a completely different set of requirements.
Right. And then what about audiology aides that don't work in the industrial side, but they are KAC certified, or they go through and get that KAC certification? So are we then, if we're going to separate it, are we then looking at separating, well, if you have KAC certification, these are kind of the different requirements and the different supervision requirements, or is it you have KAC certification and also you must work in this type of environment? If you have KAC certification, you're not in the industrial environment, then this doesn't apply. So I think it gets really a little muddy.
That's where I was leaning towards, is that maybe we want to clarify that you have to have your KAC certified, but it's because you work in that industry, in case there is an audiology aide that gets certified, because you could get certified for anything, and so, but they don't necessarily work in that field. essentially.
Can I just clarify? I want to understand, your question was who licenses and registers them, right? And that's our board. So I want to be really clear that we're the only board that licenses hearing aid dispensers, or audiology aids for that matter, right? So I think the way the law reads is the board may, I'll just read it. The last section of the definition of an audiology aid, it says the board may by regulation exempt certain functions performed by an industrial audiology aid from supervision, provided that their employer has established a set of procedures or protocols that the aid shall follow in the performance of these functions. So I think that kind of, like you said, stepping back, looking at this broadly, we have to determine if we're going to exempt them, what would be the criteria for exempting them? So I think we're kind of at that conversation. And it might be certification, it might be the setting that they're working in. But we're not just exempting them for, we want to make sure that we're identifying why we're doing it.
Okay.
Or both. Their setting they're working in and their certification.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
So, it sounds like easily providing your KAC certification, your cert is, that's the easy thing to verify, right? And do we already require that? KAOC certification proof if someone is saying they're industrial aid registering?
No, we don't require that. When you're registering aid, the supervisor has to fill out the form and tell us what exactly the aid's going to be doing. So in that part of their, and including the training, so part of the training could be like, they're going to be certified KAOC. So that's something that the supervisor would have to report to us.
And do we differentiate an industrial aid from a private practice audiology aid, or just everyone's an audiology aid?
I don't think, well, not licensing wise, they're all just an aid.
Okay.
And actually in the system, they're just a speech language pathology and audiology aid, because technically the system doesn't switch between the two. So it's just by who's your supervisor. So they're all just an aid. But they would say that in their application, but if I remember right, we don't get many that even state that they're an industrial audiology aid. So most of our audiology aids are in private practice, so.
It could very well be that they don't know to tell us too.
Yeah.
So I think the one question I wanted to ask of Sharice and Maria is, we don't have regulations that identify any industrial aid requirements, right, to my knowledge? Okay. So I also think that in the past, the board may have functioned as, okay, we have a definition, we're just calling this out, and let's just go back to focusing on the audiology aid. But the statutory authority is allowing us to say, okay, you can exempt them, but make sure that you're identifying these areas.
So then there needs to be some sort of mechanism in place
Right.
to identify them
Yeah.
and
Right.
tabulate them.
Right.
How many are there? Where are they?
Right, and I would just say from our experience, at least in our current work setting, we're cranking out KAOC certified audiology aids. Now, they're currently working for the federal government. But if they were to leave federal employment and then go get employment in a private practice, now you're going to have 45 of them that we're getting done right now, potentially going out into the community in California and saying, well, I have KAOC. So what does that mean? But I don't maybe work in the industrial setting. So I do think we need to clarify it and clarify what the requirements are to be given those exemptions in terms of supervision and what those expectations are. Is that where we're at with this discussion?
Yeah, we are. So what we can do is we can go page by page and kind of look at what we have currently and
Okay.
then determine what needs to be revised or, revised.
Hold on one second. Were there any questions about that?
And
Okay.
KAOC certification included ear mold impressions, correct? That's the problem.
So one thing I'd highlighted in one of the documents that was provided here.
The KAOC certification offers training for these individuals to take ear mold impressions that we do not allow audiology aids in practice to do. That's one of the the only real public safety concern that's
Yeah.
present.
So under the articles that were provided, the California Code of Regulations, Title 8, Section 5097, the hearing conservation, the page 3 of 4, under the second A, so about halfway down the page, says an employee not using hearing protectors shall be fitted with hearing protectors, trained in their use and care and required to use them. And I think that's where, for the KAOC training and certification comes in, well, the aid may then be taking the impressions of the ear in order to order and properly fit hearing protection. So a lot of that training does require that. So in terms of part of what they're allowed to do their day-to-day job function being very different than what our typical audiology aid is, I believe that's part of it.
All right, so if you can just pull out the text and then I could just direct you, steer everyone. I know we have a new member, so I kind of want to start from the beginning. So the purpose of this regulation is to make changes to our aids requirements, but as well as codify our initial registration process and our renewal process. So the first 3 sections are requirements for the initial registration or application. So we have a lot of the expedited process, the disclosure of any discipline and conviction, and fingerprinting. We don't need much input from the committee because it's kind of like language that are legally required, but we will probably look at it with our legal reg counsel, and we might have some changes there before we move to the board, before we present it to the board. But we'll start with 1399.154D, which is towards the end of page 5 of 16. And so we have the definition of industrial audiology aid to means a technician certified by the Council of Accreditation in Occupational Hearing Conservation. So this is probably where we want to make sure that we have a good definition where it's like, we're not restricting them, but we're also not letting people who aren't really involved in the hearing conservation program from not registering.
Would this be the place you'd also enter the setting that they worked in?
Yeah, so I did suggest some language in the discussion question. We can also add like an audiology aide who conducts audiometric tests solely for the purpose of a hearing conservation program as required by the Department of Industrial Relations, but I'm open, I'm open to anything, whatever makes clear for audiologists of like.
Yeah, I feel like that is a little, I do only do audiometric testing when I'm doing it for the hearing conservation program, but then the other days when I'm working at private practice Jones' office over here, I'm, not doing that, but I'm going to go ahead and get under the exemption. So I think the primary, to somehow define what the primary role and duties of their position is to function as part of the hearing conservation program or something of that nature.
Yeah, testing solely for the purpose of a hearing conservation program. Can we add in there that they're KOC certified?
So it already says industrial audiology aid means a technician certified by the Council for Accreditation, Occupational Hearing Conservation. So that's KOC.
Got it.
And then in addition to that, to define the place of employment so that we make sure we're capturing only people working in an industrial setting doing the hearing conservation program is what we're, I think, trying to find the language for.
In that quote, could we just add it that an audiology aide who conducts audiometric testing solely for the purpose of an industrial hearing conservation program?
You might even want to go further to say solely, well, not just solely for the purpose, but
Whose position is,
You said primary position, that's what it
primary
was.
position.
yeah, primary.
You said, and whose primary position.
Or role
role.
is to function within, not function, I don't know what word it is, within the hearing conservation program, is to perform the job duties related to the maintenance of a hearing conservation program, something of that nature.
Do we want it working through or working under the hearing conservation program?
Well, the program is the program. You could add under the supervision of, where we had that earlier, otolaryngologist, audiologist, or other physician. So, and, yeah. I think the key is that their role is, their primary job function, their role is to operate this hearing conservation program. So I would suggest clarifying that so that we have the job duty, the job type more well-defined, more clear. Mm-hmm. But I would also suggest that, we're saying that they are certified by KOC, but we're not requesting they provide that certification. I think we should, if we can.
That's part of defining it, right? So if we want to, part of the application process can be checking, is this an industrial audiology aid? If so, provide the certification. Mm-hmm. Those can be added, and they would be provisions that would, funny enough, go in the earlier part that we skipped over, because it would get added in there. And that's more clearly pulled out.
Yep. I think the challenge we may find with that is because did we change where regular audiology aids are going to have to where we're going to look at them every few years or whatever to make sure they're still
They
under?
will. They'll start doing renewals eventually.
Okay.
We have to do the regs for that. This isn't.
Yeah, so this is the reg that
is
will
it?
start that.
Okay,
implement that
so
process.
that'll make more sense then, because for the KAOC, I think it's every 2 years they have to renew. I mean, we'll want to look that up, but so they'll have to provide that renewal, otherwise they are no longer KAOC certified. They're not allowed to do any of the things according to OSHA.
Okay.
So while we would think it would be up to the employer to make sure, because they're trying to be OSHA compliant, that their aid is certified and all of that, I think it's still our responsibility to also make sure that that's the case.
They could provide proof
Mhm.
at the time of renewal.
Yeah.
Right now, the supervisors are already going to have to come back in and tell us what all they're doing and what's changed and what supervision they're providing, so,
Okay.
yeah.
So then I think the first discussion question under A, should the exemption from registration be removed? I think the answer is no, right? We're not exempting them from registration.
So that's on page 7 of 16, we're at F, so we will strike that out. And it would be in this section where we would want to add a provision where they would have to provide us proof of,
KAOC.
KAOC certification. I do want to note that I don't believe KAOC certification is required for the hearing conservation, according to the DIR's language. But I don't know, is it is it just common practice that everyone just gets certified for hearing conservation programs?
I don't believe you can do the hearing conservation without a KAOC certified aid.
Yeah,
Unless it's
that's
the
an
audiologist doing
OSHA
it.
regulation, not California.
Correct.
Okay. Let's see.
In which case, under B, should there be specific supervision requirements for an industrial audiology aid? Sorry, on page 3 of 3 in the, B. Indirect supervision may be provided to an industrial audiology aid if all the following conditions are met. But wouldn't those conditions be the place of employment and the KAOC certification?
Yeah, so that was, what's here is what we formerly had in the regulations. And we could change it. I guess the supervision would be that it sounds like they might need indirect supervision performing certain things. And so that's probably where we would not need to specify is that, where we have to distinguish the aids, regular aids from the industrial aids.
Right. So was there more discussion under item B? Indirect supervision may be provided.
Yeah, let me, I'm looking for the section.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick question? Just wondering if at some point, because it does talk about the professional in charge of the program and whether it's audiologist, otolaryngologist, or other physician, is that at some point named and/or the program, since they're overseeing the program and their work? Is that named somewhere on the application or?
We would only be, it would only, I mean, I don't think physicians or otolaryngologists have aides. I think, don't they have other people they use? I don't know how that works.
Yeah, I'm just saying for the purposes, because it says here that, the professional's responsibility include overseeing the program and their work and reviewing their audiograms and whether or not a referral is necessary. So like, is there some documentation or information about who that person is that ultimately?
Yeah, I mean, when they're registering, the supervisor, which will be an audiologist for our case, will provide us their name.
So, but I think she's raising a really good point, which is, so I'm an audiology aide. I guess this is the answer. I'm an audiology aide, which means I'm supervised by an audiologist.
Yeah.
If I'm an aide that's KAOX certified doing this OSHA, I'm not an audiology aide if I'm supervised by an otolaryngologist or I'm supervised by a physician, then they're not an audiology aide and therefore they're not subject to registration. I think that's what makes this whole thing very tricky.
Awkward, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, because I think usually, I mean, I don't know, who supports you? Like, you don't have audiology aides, what are they called? I'm assuming they're like assistants, right?
Audiologists. I truly have audiologists, not any aides.
No, okay.
Medical assistants can. I mean, I've
Medical
definitely worked in
assistants.
some ENT offices where the medical assistants were the main assistant to the docs.
And all of that's outside of our jurisdiction.
Correct,
Yeah, so-
correct. So I think the answer to that question is it doesn't, if they're not functioning under the supervision of an audiologist, they don't actually have to go and be registered through us as an audiology aide because they're not an audiology aide.
Right, because in private practice, ENT, anybody without any kind of education or certification can perform audiograms, VNGs,
Under their license,
under the license of the physician without any registration whatsoever.
yeah. Which I think is back to the discussion of why this seemed in the beginning, when we started talking about it, so futile in the sense of like, well, how many of these aides are around, right, that are supervised by an audiologist in an industrial program, but.
Until we do this, we won't know.
Exactly. Exactly.
It'll be like Paul every year when he says, one new audiology license was made this year.
Sorry.
We're looking for a specific section, but since so much of it's underlined, it's all a sea of underlined, so apologies.
It's the underline section.
That's, yeah. You need tabs. It's okay, you just want to carry on with the part of.
Yeah, so I guess for the purpose of B, we'll want to look at section, or page 12 of 16 at the top, supervision of audiology aid. And kind of look at the definition of maybe indirect supervision.
Or if you want
Right,
a
so we
separate section
can't,
for
so
the
we can't
industrial-
hold the industrial aides to the indirect supervision description.
Yeah, I noted under the issues of,
Right.
to consider some things that they should be able to do on their own, and maybe that's something that audiology aides won't be able to do on their own, so that's something we'll have to have in writing,
Like subdivision F, maybe?
yeah.
Where it talks just to industrial audiology aids in one little subsection.
I would suggest we could consider pulling the language straight from that document you already provided from the Code of Regulations on the Hearing Conservation Program.
We'll have to reference it. Office of Administrative Law doesn't like duplication, it's part of their standards, so.
Yeah, referencing
Yeah, we'll have
it.
cross-reference it, yeah.
Correct, because
Something.
it pretty well defines what they do
Yeah.
without direct supervision, if I recall. as I
Are
was
you
reading.
looking at the California Codes of Regulation 5097?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that 8, Title 8? Yep.
Yeah.
My guess is then, do you want to move on to the C question of whether or not any specific training requirements? Or it's just you provide the certification, we
This-
say, okay, go forth and follow 5097 and,
The requirement would be the
Good.
completion of the KAC
This-
training and certification.
okay.
That's what, as I'm reading it, it's pretty specific about what they do.
So easy enough to cross-reference and then,
Right, it doesn't seem reasonable to have us set a whole nother like layout and bullet point all of the things that are already laid out in that.
And we know they would have completed it if they received the certification.
Correct.
and then it just goes to 2 about the impedance battery test.
Yeah, I'm not sure so what page is that on? 399.14.11.
Page 13
18 or 16?
is where 11 starts.
Oh, thank you.
And, let's see. Where's the impedance battery? Or did you, it's not there yet?
It's not there.
Ah.
I think there was a mention about impedance battery test.
I see. I understand.
I wasn't sure how it fell in all this.
Okay, yeah.
Language.
Correct.
Or what it meant.
Correct. So on A, conduct diagnostic evaluations, including tympanometry. Well, tympanometry is one of the multiple tests involved in what we were talking about as an impedance battery. So that's the tympanometry, acoustic reflexes, acoustic decay. So I think the discussion was, do we want to just say an impedance battery, or do we want to list out every single piece of that battery, which, if you're going to say tympanometry, then you've got to say reflexes and, maybe that's where the confusion
So we're
was.
looking at maybe replacing tympanometry for impedance battery test?
Correct.
Okay, that sounds good.
Would we say battery testing?
Impedance test battery is how we would normally,
Impedance test battery.
Thank you.
or is that old language?
Don't look at me.
Do our students still talk about the impedance I believe so.
Yeah,
Okay. We know what that is, impedance battery?
you just looked at the old guy for that.
What?
And I think that was it. That was just all my questions.
Okay.
Great.
Do we open for public comment, or do we move?
Even if there's nobody here.
Okay. Any public comment on the items discussed? No? Okay. Do we need a motion to, as suggested with the suggested motion language?
Yeah, it's on page 3 of 3. And I think there was a recommendation to maybe recommend this to the speech language pathology practice committee, since this includes them as well, giving them an opportunity to maybe look at the supervision of aides one more time before taking it to the board.
My only thought being is we have some very much word smithing to do on some of these definitions.
Or we should come back?
I think you should come back. We're already going to meet in
Agreed.
November,
Yeah.
and so we can just have another audiology committee with some actual language and see if we like it.
Okay. Would the recommendation be that the speech pathology committee discuss this before audiology comes back to it for the final round?
I think we just might want to recommend that they also meet.
Okay.
And
Apart
recommend to
from
the chair
this.
that they need to meet. One of the things, once you start looking at this, is you're like, oh, we really beefed up supervision for these audiology aids, and then you're like, what's required for the speech aid? Crickets, and
Okay.
so, might just be worth another, like, are we sure we're okay with this, or do we want to tack on some of the similarities about, indirect, immediate?
Okay.
It's just kind of, once you really clearly define one, and then you look at the other, and you're like, oh, this is kind of wide open, so it's like, well, maybe they want to take another look again, but, maybe we'll get lucky and we'll have another speech pathologist on the board by then, so a full committee.
Fingers crossed.
That would be nice.
Okay.
So,
Okay, so for now, we're not going to take any action. We'll table it and come back.
Yeah, you could just direct board staff to include today's discussion into the text and bring it back.
Okay, please. Yes, please.
be so directed.
So directed. Any other committee discussion items? Question, as the committee, audiology committee, when there are, so the normal board procedures, that you're not discussing items that aren't on the agenda, and then things have to be agendized. I imagine the practice committee follows the same procedures. So if there were any issues that the members of the committee wanted to make sure we talk about at our next practice committee.
So I do believe, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, we recommended the board chair an issue be discussed by a committee, and then she'll make that assignment or not, depending on her preference. So I believe that's the way we try to do that. So that way it's not a free-for-all.
Okay.
The committee can make all their own kind of work, but we're always going to the chair to make sure that's the direction the board wants to go.
So should any of the audiology practice committee members have issues that come up that they would like to raise to discuss at the committee, we need to bring that forth at the full board meeting for something
Or
to be
email
agendized.
the board chair
Okay.
at least 6 to 8 weeks prior to a board meeting.
Gotcha.
Board agendas start quite early, so.
Okay.
Also, after the committee meets, sometimes, we come up with ideas, or we come up with thoughts, concepts. When you're giving your report during the board meeting, that's a good time to bring it up, and then at that time, if the board chair wants to discuss it further, or assign it, or delegate it to the committee, she can do that.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Then we will go ahead and end our practice committee for audiology. It is, well, I can't read my watch.
1:52.
1:52, thank you.
I have several. You want to-